All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to IT Trendsetters. My name is Chris Lee. I'm here with my co-host Kirk. Kirk is the CTO, co-founder of SynerComm. Our guest today is Matt Peters. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your company.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Peters. I'm the Chief Product Officer at a company called Expel. We do managed detection and response. So help customers by connecting up to all their technology, watching for signs of potential attacker activity, and then coming in to help investigate and remediate. We've been around for about 5 years. Started out of the Washington, D.C. area, and been growing like a weed ever since. As Chief Product Officer, I'm responsible for a bunch of different functions. So we have built a custom bespoke platform, and so I'm responsible for the engineering team that builds that platform. I'm also responsible for the security operations function. So think 24/7 monitoring, response, that kind of stuff, as well as product development and product direction. So it's a pretty awesome role and pretty interesting company.
Awesome. And you've been there since day one, it sounds like.
So I was actually, I was employee number one. I remember swiping my personal credit card in a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia to buy our first piece of commercial software to start the company, it was a really interesting, at least I think a really interesting journey. The original founders we all met at Mandy, and then we were acquired by FireEye. And there we were doing a sort of a similar business where we were helping people in doing managed service around advanced persistent threats. And after the acquisition by FireEye, the founders, Justin, Mark, and Yannick, left FireEye, and they were sort of kicking around, and they had a bit of a brainstorm where they were basically saying, like, there's a problem with managed services as they currently are, right? And there's sort of a continuum of problems, and people have solved parts of the problem, but the problem space is moving. So on one side, you have sort of traditional managed services, so like log-based compliance monitoring kind of services. And those are good if you need to get compliant with PCI, something like this. But in the middle, you had, like, as threats got more advanced and as technologies got more advanced, technologically advanced security people are hard to find, right? Like it's difficult. It's a difficult hiring market. And so MDR, managed detection and response, evolved out of that. And that was like companies saying, we will operate and do high quality response on really advanced technology and help you out with that. But in order to scale, many of the MDRs focused, they sort of solved only part of the problem, which was like, we'll only focus on EDR, or we'll only focus on our own technology. That FireEye, that's what we did. And a lot of customers were like, look, I already bought a bunch of technology and I have a bunch of different tech and I'd like somebody to use all of it. And so sort of the founders had the idea, like, well, could we build high quality forensic response on top of like disparate technology, and what would it take to do that? And so that was sort of the genesis of Expel, is we want to help customers kind of make sense of all of the stuff that's out there and get to answers and high quality response quickly across the technology they've already invested in. So that's kind of our sweet spot.
Cool. Well, before you guys even get a little more nerdy on me here, first off, congrats on, looks like you guys just raised a bunch of money.
Yep.
Series E funding. Can you talk to us a little bit about where you guys are going with that funding? And I guess Series E seems like you've gotten pretty far. So
Yep.
What does that look like from a business standpoint?
Sure. So we've been in business for about 5 years and kind of going after sort of the managed detection and response market. We started out covering traditional infrastructure, and we've expanded over the last couple of years to cover cloud infrastructure, SaaS apps, things like this. We raised a recent round of capital to kind of continue that journey. So we can see a couple of things on the horizon that I think are really, really exciting. So first, continuing to talk about and cover cloud security. And that goes all the way from, I'm running some commercial applications in Azure or AWS or something like that, to I built my own application and I'd like that covered, to newer infrastructures like Kubernetes and things like that. So like pushing the envelope in sort of what managed detection and response can do in the cloud is one of our big investment areas. Another thing that we're planning on doing is leaning a lot into international expansion. We've done really, really well here in continental United States, and sort of looking at, we've already acquired some customers overseas, and so leaning into that a little bit more as a thing, and then just building out making continued investments in the platform and the company and this sort of stuff. So a lot of rapid growth along those lines, but exciting times to be sure. I, as a technologist, I was looking at the thing and go, okay, well, now I can build even more cool toys. And so a lot of the features and a lot of the functions that we're looking at are really exciting, as add-ons to stuff we've already done.
Very nice. Well, congrats again.
Well, thank
It's
you so
awesome.
much.
I got a couple of things that just come to mind right as we speak here. You mentioned kind of the MDR space. Since there was kind of your people like yourself in the MDR, then you had the EDR vendors that are out there increasing the end nodes part specifically. And then they also offer a managed service sometimes. So if I'm a client saying, well, I've already got one of these end nodes and they want to manage it, what would be different about an MDR versus going with a vendor in their managed offering?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and so I think the question a customer wants to look at when they're trying to select, am I going to do an EDR based or like a product based service, like a CrowdStrike Falcon Complete, something like this, or I want to go to an MDR that covers a little bit more technology, maybe their own stuff, or something like an Expel where you cover like a range of different types of technology. It doesn't have to be the vendor's technology. The thing that you want to ask is, so like, where do you see the most bang for your security buck, right? So if you've got heavy instrumentation off of your EDR, and that's the kind of the one signal that you're really, really worried about, then going with a vendor's solution could be a really good idea, because they'll know their technology really well and be able to respond to it. One of the things that we do find is that sometimes provides sort of a bit of a lacuna, a little bit of a blank space in response, because if I cover only the EDR, then that network signal that allows me to track in uninstrumented places. So for example, one of our customers has a server farm that they cannot instrument with an EDR. They just can't run EDRs on those servers. There's a series of performance reasons that they need to keep the servers light, fair enough. And so what they've done is they built a compensating security control. They've ringed that with a set of network technologies to sort of look for things like beaconing and inbounds and stuff like this. If you were to go with an EDR only solution, you basically can't monitor with that infrastructure. But if you go with either an MDR that covers both network and endpoint, or a vendor like Expel where we connect to all that technology, you're going to get that full picture. One of the things that we found is there are tons of investigations where we'll start with a signal from here, and we'll collect SIM information, we'll collect information out of the EDR, we'll collect some stuff from the network, and that'll build the full picture. And I think like that's a thing that we feel is really important, is to be able to have that full picture for response. And sometimes that can be lacking if you're only covering one technology. But again, there's a lot of business decision that goes on in that too, right? So maybe people do want to do that, so that's what you would weigh.
Now, I think one of your secret sauces, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is the ability to take those signals, because it's not just one signal, like you said, it's going to be multiple things before it's more and more confidence that this is actually something I need to react on. And that's a fine line between an art and a science at some point, right? And so that's got to, and then you have the XDR world, which sounds like that's kind of an industry way to try and go about and doing what MDR is doing today. So can you kind of tell me, is that one of the specials? How do you scale all these different signals readings to find all these events that there's a lot of processing going on, obviously, to figure out if this happens, that happened, that now it's really getting bad. How do you go about that? It sounds like that was one of the philosophies up front, was trying to figure out the shortcomings. That was kind of the vision of a SIM at some point. Let's take all this data and we'll look for things and we'll correlate the logs and and what's the difference between what you're doing and what those methods try to do? Or
it's actually a great question, and I think that that some of what we've done was, you're right, sort of the promise of the SIM industry. And I think like there's a few things that if you look back, the technology was a little bit like the promise of SIM led a little bit to some of the technology that was available at the time. And I think like you look around now and things have advanced tremendously. What we've ended up doing is we identified that what you have to do is first, we focus on the fact that there's plenty of good detection technology out there. So I'm going to connect up to lots of different things. And because there are APIs available, I can make a deep API-based connection to various technologies. I'm going to pull the alert signal back and I'm going to normalize it. So I'm going to turn it into something that's relatively canonical. I'm going to make all the EDR alerts look roughly the same. And that's actually more complicated than you'd think, because if you look at the different vendors, what they include in an alert versus the other information they have is pretty different. So we end up having to do a bunch of back and forth with different vendors to get, in the EDR case, like I have a process lineage and I have a whole bunch of other command line arguments, that sort of stuff, which we had to build out of the alert. And what that does is enables us to then have a layer on top of that does like sort of more advanced correlation. I've got these alerts, which were surfaced by different detection technology. And now I'm going to correlate across those alerts with, some time series analysis, with some standard correlation rules, with some, machine learning stuff. We can raise and lower severities, that sort of thing. And all of that stuff kind of, and we can filter and bounce that against stuff that we know about our customers. Because the other thing that we realized, having done this a couple of times, is if I know something like my customer's business hours, it's a weird piece of data, but if I do know it, I know that that admin login is in the middle of the night for them. Wherever they're located, that's not their core business hours. That's weird to me. That gets my attention. Or I'm going to know that that's a second shift worker. And so therefore, it's not weird that they log in at that hour, that sort of stuff. So I'm going to give my analysts more context. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we did, and this was one of the things where we leaned in early, and you've got to kind of do this early, is we instrumented the platform we built. So we're talking about custom software. We made sure to measure everything in it. So I can tell you exactly what the analysts click on whenever they triage a particular type of alert. And we watch that carefully. So we can tell you that 75% of the time in response to this alert, they go here, and then they go here, then they go here. Awesome. Next time that alert happens, we're going to automate all of that. So all of those steps, all of that fetching of extra information happens when the alert shows up. So what that does is allows me to accelerate. It allows me to make sure that the human isn't wasting their time clicking around to places, that kind of thing. And if you focus on that and you then think about the user experience, you get a lot better. So like the example I always give people is like, next time you're getting off an airplane, try to get a look at the dashboard on the airplane, because what you're going to see is you're going to see LCD display panels, but they look like dials. And the reason they do that is because they figured out that pilots can look at a dial out of the corner of their eye and make a very quick decision. To look at an LCD with a digital display, you have to read it. That kind of UX, that kind of like decision support is the kind of thing we focused a lot on, so we can get our folks, combat effective. Because again, it's like, I need to take an analyst and make them effective across a range of tech. So I'm going to try to elide all that difference, and a range of customers. So I'm going to try to get enough context to elide that difference. You're absolutely right. The EDR tools are trying to do a very similar thing. People have woken up to the idea, I think, that it's not just about detection. Detection is critically important, just step one, but there is user interaction, there is context, there is investigative process, there is, all of that sort of stuff rolls in. So a lot of the XDR platforms are putting that together now so that you don't have to build it yourself. And so that's where I think the market is kind of heading.
Are you kind of a XDR by default? By how you're designed, or I mean,
so it's a really interesting question, and I think it will depend on which analyst firm you ask and on what day. So we think of ourselves, a couple of the different analyst firms have coined a phrase, open XDR. Mm-hmm. So we're not vendor specific, but we provide a lot of the same capabilities. So it's an opinionated framework. It's significantly more opinionated than, say, a SIM. It's an opinionated framework for investigation, and it provides a lot of those excess capabilities. It also, we do automatic remediation from our platform, that sort of stuff. So all of that like wiring is there. So yeah, you can definitely think of it that way. It's interesting because, and I'm not going to say that we didn't think about this ahead of time, because we sort of had this notion. We actually have customers using our platform as a standalone product on their own. They're like, I'm doing my case management and my investigations in, we call our product Workbench, in Workbench. And that's been a really cool thing. So we are sort of starting to tend to see bumping into that open XDR. So absolutely.
Great. So, I mean, when you started all this, you kind of had some of the Get SIM, which was kind of obviously MSSPs were tolerated at best most of the times, and they kind of still are in a lot of ways, right? No one's like in love with their MSSP a lot of times. Then there's attempts to solve it with like SOAR, and then the EDR, a lot of alphabet soup, I guess. So what do you see is that differentiator? What's your long-term differentiator from all these piece parts that are out there?
So I think it's a great question, and I would start with one thing, which is that we're bringing together a mixture. Like, we believe that this solution isn't necessarily 2 patents and a rules engine. We have an opinionated framework, and we have an automation engine, and we have integrations, and all of that kind of comes together in understanding this problem space. So I would look at something like any one of the vendors who have bought a SOAR product, because you see people going in this direction. So I had a SIM, or I had a network technology, or an EDR, and I bought a SOAR technology because I want to add this automation component because I understand it's important. Many times the vendors are not going to show up with an opinionated framework to say, like, you can just plug this in and go. But like when we built it, we were like, it needs to go from day one. So we show up with all of the detections already pre-built. We show up with a lot of the automation already there, and then it's customizable in a way that will help security operators. And the last magic element that we think of is this, and it's going to sound like motherhood and apple pie. So like, let me just be clear on this. There's a human at the center of this problem, and there always will be. Okay, you cannot automate this whole problem away. And I think that one of the things sometimes the industry misses is they think like you can buy one more, it's just one more piece of tech, just buy one more piece of technology and you solve this problem. And it's like, no, you buy one more piece of technology and then you need one more person to run that tech too, right? This at the end of the day, there are humans doing human stuff in the center of this. So it does come down to this mixture of there's automation, there's monitoring, there's detection, there's response, and there's like user experience. And so that's, I think, like if I thought about the differentiator, we constantly have customers coming to us going, your onboarding was the easiest thing I've ever seen. Like I literally had a customer the other day who was like, they were clicking through this onboarding wizard, they're like, just saved a week, you know, that kind of thing. When we do investigations and incidents, people come back and they go like, that was the clearest thing I've ever seen. Like that's awesome. There are people at the center of this. And I think that the biggest hurdle to security success for most industries or most companies is that there's a big moat around security because all the technology is so forbidding, I guess.
So that being said, now also, when you start bringing new account on, what are the key technologies that are will give you the best data points or signals to actually start getting visibility? I know there's a lot of components to that, whether it's encodes but you know, is there the short list of, you know, kind of like must-haves?
Well, so I'll definitely go, I'll basically start, like there's three I'm going to ask about just out of the gate. If I'm protecting traditional infrastructure, I'm going to ask like, do you have an endpoint? Do you have an EDR of some sort? And by EDR, what I really mean there is not necessarily a source of detection, but I would like that, but also something that provides me investigative telemetry. So this is a thing that a lot of people scream by when they're buying tech, is they'll buy something that can ring the alarm bell. Right? Okay, fair enough. Like an AV, awesome. You probably need to have one. There's a compliance checkbox for that. But what that's not going to let you do is ask a follow-up question like, what happened next? Right? An EDR is going to let you do that. And so that's like one of the first things we're going to do is ask like, what have you got and how instrumented is it? Right? Second thing I'm going to look for, because my background is in network technologies, is I'm going to like, do you have something on your network that does DPI? Do you have IPS, IDS, some sort of full packet solution? Do you have something ringing your infrastructure? That's that kind of stuff. So I can get some notion of like what's bubbling out, you know, what's contacting the outside world, that sort of thing. The third thing we're going to ask about is a SIM. And I think one of the things that people oftentimes are a little bit, I don't want to say derogatory, but they tend to dismiss SIM as sort of like, yesterday's news. I will tell you what, SIM might not be my first choice for detecting things in the main, right? Depending on what kind of logging you have and stuff like this. But the number of times we'll pivot into a SIM to get historical information during an investigation is huge. And if you have a SIM infrastructure and you're well instrumented, it can actually provide a tremendous amount of value. I think in every single one of these cases, in the traditional infrastructure case, I would warn everybody, like, do not make perfect the enemy of the good. Right. So the number of times people are like, well, you know, we have an EDR, but we're only like 85% instrumented. Okay, cool. That's better than 0% instrumented. Let's connect up. That'll get us started, you know, that kind of thing. And we can build to better. I have a SIM, but it doesn't have all the right logs. Okay, fair enough. But we'll still connect to it and we'll figure out what other logs we need and we'll build over time. I think oftentimes people are like, well, our program isn't done until it's perfect. And I'm like, I've been doing this a long time. It's never perfect, right? Ever. Right. On the cloud side, it's more interesting, I think, because the puck is still moving rapidly, right? I don't think anyone would disagree with the technologies I just named for the enterprise infrastructure. But I'll tell you, for cloud, one of the things we do is we connect directly up to the cloud providers to get some of the telemetry directly and build detections on it directly, because when we started this journey, the detection technology in the cloud was significantly more immature. Now you've got a whole bunch of different vendors, you know, from CSPM vendors, you know, posture management folks, all the way through to cloud detection stuff. You have traditional vendors moving into the cloud space, so I think it's going to become a crowded and kind of more varied space. But the thing I would do is, you know, absolutely, if you're in something like an AWS has some built-in detections, and you should turn them on. Right. Two, like they have some standards on how to configure things. You should do those, like at the very minimum. Right. And then a lot of different vendors have, you know, some additional add-ons and things like this. Like I said, we built some of our own detections to get out of the box and running. So that's kind of what I would say.
That's all good stuff. Do you see anything you talked about? What about the like the Microsoft apps or the, you know, different SaaS apps? Is there much the kind of signals come from those types of apps?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the things that we actually do, we actually have a portion of our business where we'll connect up to a number of different SaaS apps and protect them. So from O365, which is actually one of the places we see a lot of our attacks, because something like 60% of the incidents we see are like start with either credential stolen or BEC, something like this. So protecting your Office apps and watching for interesting malicious behavior is huge, right? All the way through to things like Okta and Box and Dropbox and stuff like this, because if you think about it, the stuff that your IPS was trying to find, 10 years ago, all of those techs have moved out onto the cloud. So like now your files are in Box and now your mail is in O365 and this sort of stuff. So protecting those things is hugely important. So a couple of things I'd call out. A number of the vendors have built in their own detections. And like, I will say that Microsoft, for the cost of it, has an E5 license that gets you a lot of security trimmings, right? In fact, like, you turn that on and you basically bought the known universe. So you can do that. But we also look at, when you're looking at SaaS apps, the attack surface changes. So if you're talking about traditional infrastructure, it's a desktop, laptop server, something like this. In a SaaS app, it's really a user account. And so you need to kind of change your thinking a little bit to anomaly detection. So that's one of the reasons I think you've seen this like increase in UEBA tech, is because so many things are about like, can I detect malicious activity in this application? Right. And so that's where you get like, your exabeams and things like this kind of made hay building out that tech.
Sure. Now, what about the whole Internet of Things? Is that really hit mainstream yet? Is there much going on there, or is that a different type of problem?
So it's a great question, and actually it's a place that we're kind of exploring. One of the things that we see is there are a couple of vendors. Armis is a good example of this. You've got and IoT, like there's a continuum, right? So IoT all the way over to OT. So like Armis here, Clarity, this sort of stuff. There's a number of different vendors that are going in here. I will tell you that if it has an operating system on it, and everything from your smart fridge to your phone has an operating system on it, like it's going to be potentially an attack vector. What we see a lot is in places where the footprint is a lot of embedded devices and things like this. So you think healthcare, you think like manufacturing, stuff like this. Their problem set is slightly different because the telemetry you can get and the way a response would work are different, but some of the sort of the threat space is very, very similar. We've seen things like point of sale systems turned into like coin mining farms and things like this. Like that stuff happens. So I do think that there's room there. I haven't seen the sort of the convergence in vendors yet. So that's a thing that I think more people will sort of like start looking at and saying, oh, okay, well now that I've got something for my traditional enterprise, let's look out on the floor and go, oh my heavens, I have there's 40 cash registers per store and I have 300 stores. It's eyes up time, that kind of thing.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about your role, or an MDR's role, in something like the Log4j situation.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So one of the things that I would tell everybody is, and again, motherhood and apple pie. All of the best things you can do for security are all relatively straightforward, right? But one of the things that as an organization running software you want to do is you want to have some sort of a response plan for when something like this comes out. Now, your MDR provider should be in this condition contacting you to say, hey, there is this vulnerability, right? If they know your environment, like reaching out and saying, hey, there's this vulnerability, and we think you might be vulnerable to it, right? Particularly if they have a vulnerability management component to their service or something, they can probably proactively do that. But then the other thing is, can your MDR provider stretch, right? Can they then say, okay, we know what an attack on this would look like. We're going to go look for evidence of it, so that we're not just responding kind of after. We're going to get a little proactive here. We're going to dig in. And then the last thing, and this is when you ask about differentiator, something that we're actually really proud of, is that we say that we're transparent, right? The workbench that we use to do our work is also 100% available to our customers, so they can come in and see all of the stuff we do in real time. One of the things I would say, if anybody's using a third-party provider, and I always encourage people to, I am a third-party provider, is are they transparent? Like are they an extension of your team? Like when the balloon goes up and you're dealing with a Log4j thing, you have a plan for how your organization is going to operate. How well does your vendor fit into that plan? How well does the communication go? Right? That's a thing from an MDR perspective. The last thing I call out is a longer term thing. right? So one of the things that I deal with a lot is security teams who are building their own detections, they're writing their own stuff, they're building their own infrastructure, that kind of thing, which is all very interesting and I think sometimes useful activities. But as the security landscape shifts and you see things like Log4j, SolarWinds, et cetera, where the risk is actually coming from these third parties, right? The risk isn't like, it's not in my business, it's in my supplier's business.
Sure.
The notion of what your team might want to be focused on may want to shift, right?
Mhm.
And so if you think about the security team in 5 years, I think they're going to be a lot more embedded in the business. They're going to be worried a lot more about third-party risks. They're going to be thinking a lot more about supply chain stuff, things like this, and a little bit less about detection, because detection is one of those things that you can actually get a third party to be very, very good at, right? So I think as the puck moves, we may see an evolution in that direction, right? Similar to like IT outsourcing as an example. Like if you back up 30 years ago, 40 years ago, nobody did IT outsourcing because it was really complicated. You had to do that yourself. And then it kind of became a little bit more, de rigueur, and people started doing it as outsourcing. So,
Sure. Then, is there any lessons to be learned from? I don't know if it affected many of the security tools, but the Amazon outage last week.
Yeah. So, well, thankfully we weren't particularly affected. Although I'll tell you, like everybody learned. So I don't know if you remember, but a number of years ago, AWS East went down. And everybody got hit. It turned out absolutely everybody, because it was kind of your default region, and so like everybody had stuff. In fact, a lot of people's status pages were still, had dependencies on AWS East. So when the whole thing went down, it was bad news for everybody. I think people learned, and so it was a little bit less impactful, although still a big thing. One of the things that, and this is again, it's still motherhood and apple pie, is if you have not exercised your disaster recovery protocol, you should. Right? If you have failover in your application, if you have failover in your sites, things like this, you should practice that, right? One of the things, I was actually talking to somebody about this recently. So we had a kind of a funny incident at a company I was working at a number of years ago, where the internet went down in the region that we were in, right? And we were running a 24/7 operation. They were doing the shift handoff, and the follow the sun shift handoff to the facility I was in, right as the internet went down. And so people started, they were like, somebody should contact IT, but we realized no one had IT's phone number, because you could always look it up on the internet. Well, without the internet, like we couldn't do that. And so there we were, just so it was just, it went to like going around to people going, hey, do you have a texting relationship with someone in IT that we can use to contact this thing, right? And so the disaster recovery protocol there ended up having to be, you have to have a couple phone numbers printed out and put on the wall, because that's the best way to do that sort of thing. It's those kind of exercises that you want to run through to really knock the dust off of, does this thing really work? Because when AWS East went down the first time, and people realized their status pages were dependent on it, they realized this cascading chain of failures that like hinge on some stuff. So that's sort of like a lot of very high level to say, I think like disaster recovery protocols are a thing that like people should be into and testing.
So then going forward here, it looks like, if you're trying to put your head on, there's kind of two ways to go about this. There's some of the hot vendors that kind of like all these tools over the last 30 years, I've kind of seen they want to become the system. Let's say CrowdStrike or something. So they're going to add all these other components in, and versus someone like yourself that's going to go the other way and say these tools are great. There's probably tools that aren't even invented yet that are going to come out that I'll need to throw in here quickly so I can always be agile. So I guess, how do you see the landscape looking in 3 years from now?
I think it's a great question. I think that what is likely to happen, and my crystal ball is as foggy as everybody else's, but like I think that you're going to see the big vendors, the big players, as they're looking for continuing expansion of their market share, to add blades onto their architecture. So I mean, like this goes all the way back. I mean, you can back up 10 years ago to like Checkpoint and their blade architecture, and they're adding stuff to that UTM box,
Right.
And they'll add functions, and if you're in a situation where that like form factor makes sense, and by form factor I don't just mean like the hardware, but I mean like you buy an EDR and that's really going to be the centerpiece of your security suite. I think that could make sense for folks. I think the thing is that you're always going to end up with those, like, I don't want to say one-offs, but like, CrowdStrike, to use them as an example, isn't going to build everything, right? They're going to build a set of stuff on top of their EDR. And so you're going to end up with 4 or 5 other technologies. And so the question you got to ask yourself is like, where do I put my energies, right? Many of our customers are looking at things like, I'm going to centralize around Microsoft because I can train my team on one thing. right?
Mhm.
I can train them on the Microsoft stack, right?
Right.
CrowdStrike, if they built out the full EDR suite, you might be able to train your whole team on CrowdStrike. I think the thing that will drive the choices that people make will be much more on how available talent is, right? And how hard it is to get that talent trained up. So like, I think a lot of people will end up saying, look, I only can afford 2 people, and those 2 people I can't have messing around with any tech because they got to worry about third-party risk and audit and everything else. I'm outsourcing this problem, right? And I think as people get more and more comfortable, I think that's the direction you're going to see them going. And then vendors like Expel, I think, make a lot more sense if you're thinking about it like a system, because that's going to come across multiple different techs, right? So hopefully I answered your question.
That makes sense. Yeah. So, the whole, when you started all this a few years ago, obviously you kind of got ahead of the MLAI curve.
Yep.
When you started doing, you were kind of thinking about what data you needed to collect. It's actually turned out to be one of probably your big advantages, right? Is you've inherently built in things that you can learn what's going on. And that's a kind of a unique skill set. I noticed Gartner has you kind of on they have the MDR on they call it now what do they call it? It's going through the trough of disillusionment.
Trough of disillusionment, trough of despair. Yeah, absolutely.
There, yeah. So any comments on that and where it's we got to talk a little bit about where you think the future is, but
sure. I think, one of the things is, and it is, I mean, I'll talk about the trough of disillusionment for just a second. Like, it is human nature that people come out with something new and everyone's like, oh my God, this changes everything, right? I mean, that has been, I read this fascinating book about it, like in Holland in the 1600s, they had a boom surrounding the tulip bulb. Like, they were like, tulips, it's the new Bitcoin, or whatever. And it's like, people are always like that. So MDR comes out and everyone's like, oh, this is like, we've discovered fire, like it's new. I've been doing this for a long time. We discover fire every 2 or 3 years. And then we go through this arc, right? I think that MDR has a really solid place in the security architecture of a lot of companies who cannot staff up a full 24/7 response capability. I do not think we are going to solve, cold fusion. Like, we're not equipped to do that, right? We solve a certain class of the problem. In terms of like being ahead of the curve on machine learning and some of those technologies, I will say, one of the things that I think is so interesting is the white whale, the thing that all machine learning researchers are after is labeled data, right? If I have this is good and this is bad, and I have a corpus of that data, I can do all sorts of modeling. I can figure out all sorts of different ways to build classifiers and stuff like this. And if you think about a security operations center, that is what it is. They are label generators, right? Like, you can think about, like, all day long, we're saying, well, that's good and that's not, and that's good and that's not, and that sort of thing. And the key thing is then the data cleanliness. And so if you start your MDR with a couple of data scientists and they're building out data cleanliness the whole time, those things become a lot easier. So that's one of the advantages I think that we've had, which has been super awesome. Again, though, I don't think I've discovered fire, and I don't think it's the only thing, right? So we use machine learning models. Like, we have one in particular I'll just call out. We raise and lower the severity of PowerShell-based alerts based on the command line arguments, because we built a model that sort of understands that's creepy and that's not. It's one input into a human decision, right? Because at the end of the day, I do not believe, robots are going to 100% take over the universe.
So I think one thing that's unique, also a couple of things I wanted to mention about how you approach things is, I know you're involved with the whole phishing / business email compromise, and that's probably an interesting part because people probably didn't necessarily think of that as a solution. And then also the kind of working throughout the whole life cycle of security. You work with clients each year and kind of set goals to improve their security posture. Maybe people don't always think of a detection and response company, helping on the proactive side. Do you want to comment on those?
Sure, yeah. So the phishing one was interesting because what sort of our mission statement as a company is we make space for people to do what they love about security. Like, we make space by giving you back time. You don't have to do alert triage, things like this. And so we started out traditional infrastructure, built out the cloud offering, and then what we discovered was people came back and said, cool, that's super awesome. But the thing that's burning me down now is I get these emails submitted to this phishing inbox and I got to deal with them, right? Like, I can't, if the CFO sends in a thing saying, is this phishing? Like, you're not going to turn that around in 24 hours. You're going to turn that around fast, right? So this was kind of burning folks up, and it's really kind of annoying work. There's a bunch of little, like corner cases and stuff. There's a reason SOAR vendors have gone after it. It's actually kind of a pain point. And we looked at this and we said, could the same decision support, same engine, same normalization, same machine learning engine, that sort of stuff apply in the phishing case? Can I make analysts combat effective deciding phishing or not against email that is fundamentally a business-oriented function. Because if you think about it, deciding whether something is phishing or deciding whether something is spam, it requires a lot of business context. So it's a really good challenge. What we discovered is actually, yes, we can. We actually are pretty good at it. We're pretty fast at it. And one of the other things that's really nice is we've discovered along the way all of the kind of interesting things like, if you want to discover whether something's phishing or not, one of the things that's really useful is if there's an address in the, the PO request or whatever, look up the address on like an MLS listing, because if it's a 2-bedroom ranch style house in like, San Diego, probably not the world headquarters of some manufacturing company or just out of a thing. So we learn all those kind of interesting tips and tricks. So like that's been kind of an interesting journey. The other thing is, in addition to giving our customer space, it's provided us a really great way to get people interested and into cybersecurity in a slightly like less high impact way, because taking somebody kind of like new on the journey and putting them on this, like the hot seat on an MDR on a night shift, that's rough. Right. But having them start with phishing and then graduating the MDR is actually kind of a nice career path. So we've done a lot of that. To address your second question about life cycle, absolutely. One of the things that I find a little disappointing, quite frankly, is there seems to be sort of like two camps in security. There's probably more than that, but like for the purposes of this discussion, there's people who do like alerts and we're working the glass 24/7, we do things. And there's people who try to like improve the business. So they talk about like NIST CSF or like strategy or whatever. And marrying the two of those worlds tends to be something that eludes people a lot. But I'm looking at it, I'm like, when we started the business, we're like, look, if we have statistics on what tends to happen, and we can come back to you and say, if you would do these things, this would happen. You can make a business case out of that. The other thing, and so like we can literally come in and say, look, 37% of the time we see this, it's a result of this. Your control is not on. If you turned it on, it's going to have this impact. We can get proactive there. But the thing that's even cooler is, and this is like an aha. We ended up a couple of times. We have the platform can do automatic cohort analysis. It can say like these customers are like these customers, and we end up in a situation where we'll look and we'll say, well, your response time, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, is 2 times better than anyone else in your cohort. And we've had this happen when the customer's like, excellent, I'm going to take that to my board of directors because that's the result of 2 quarters worth of investment I've made in the team and all our response things. It gives you an ability. If you focus on the data, if you focus on these metrics, you can actually see measurable statistical impact in what's going on in your environment, right? So like we've had customers turn on a control and we've watched alerts for a particular thing drop off the map. Mm-hmm. This is awesome stuff. It just seems like it's awfully hard to get people in that mode of bridging those two worlds.
That's one of your, I think, key differentiators also is the amount of time, the turnaround time on something. Your opportunity to detect something, you have a pretty high goal for yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we, one of the whole point of the platform, because we believe that if you let stuff sit, it's like fish, it doesn't get better sitting around. And ransomware, you need to get ahead of it, right? Like you have a few minutes to get ahead of ransomware. And if you don't, then hope you have some backups. Right. So what we've got is the whole system we built is around decision support and getting to a decision. Is this a thing or is this not a thing as fast as humanly possible? So for instance, right now, our 98th percentile for criticals is 1.2 minutes from the time it hits our queue to the time an analyst makes a decision. 98% of the time, it's less than 1.2 minutes, right? If you extend that out to mediums, which is most of the stuff we tend to see, it only goes up to 7 minutes, right? So we can be median alert to all the way to remediation, all the way to fix in 21 minutes. Right. And that gets us ahead of most classes of thing as long as we can get the detection signal in. So that is, and that's a thing that people want to be able to do. And if you're running a business where you have people that are working late hours, you're working around the clock, something like this, you want to be able to maintain that, right? The number of people I talk to are like, well, I've got a couple of people, they work normal business hours. Like, okay, so your actual time to respond, if it comes in at 5:01, is going to be 12 hours. Like, that's not good. So that's one of the places where a 24/7 facility really comes in handy, and having that, like, people are frosty all the time.
Mm-hmm. Ransomware, we kind of hear that, and I think it's kind of run its course a little bit, but are you still seeing lots of ransomware out there?
We are, and I think it's going to be one of these things. Like, we see a combination of stuff. So we see some stuff that is disruptive, like we have some customers or in some industries that like suffer sort of like targeted disruption, that kind of thing. But it tends to be, we're now seeing a lot more sort of opportunistic stuff, right? And the curse of the opportunistic stuff is if you're in a business where you weren't really expecting to be targeted of something like this, Then again, back to your disaster recovery stuff, maybe your disaster recovery plans aren't top notch. So you really have to lean on catching this stuff early. We're seeing that defenders are getting a little bit better, endpoints are getting better at like watching like entropy of writes and stuff like this, but there's still, we're still seeing a reasonable amount of this. We also see, like, at the end of the day, so much of cybercrime is basically a business, right? So we, in addition to seeing that, we see like coin mining and stuff like this. Like, if you're running, unprotected EC2 instances, you're probably running some coin mining right now. That's just sort of the way that is. Is another thing that we see a lot of. So, and then also the BEC stuff, which tends to be, again, financially motivated. So we see a lot of like transfer money, buy gift cards, the huge. So
yeah, you're seeing that. So here's one that's always near and dear to my heart that our company, we like working with you guys because you guys do all the things we don't want to do. We have no desire. We want to be there our goal is to be that 99% of the time we don't have an active incident, helping you get better with pen testing and all these other things and adversary simulations and all that. So you are ready to go. We don't want anything to do with the response. You work really, really well with us. But one that always gets to me is a lot of people, what do people do with custom web apps? How do you secure those? Because that's a huge thing. They're all over the place and everybody seems to kind of ignore those. You know what I'm saying as far as
absolutely, yeah 100%. Like so there's a couple things. One of the things that our engine allows us to do, and depending on how you have your app instrumented, is we can actually end up raising alerts and like running through our engine to sort of normalize them and be able to respond to them. The key thing that usually requires, though, is being able to sit down with whoever built the app. And this is the part of the problem, is like a lot of times you'll come in and like, who built it? Somebody who left 5 years ago, something like that. And that becomes a little bit more challenging. But if you're talking about a custom app, we tend to look at things and say, okay, well, there are a few classes of attack that this thing's going to suffer from. What would happen if X, Y, and Z? Where are your big security pinch points? We can do a little bit of risk analysis and you can say, okay, well, we have detections around this and this and this and this. Those detections will bubble up into, like, say, our SIM, and that's where our ability to integrate into a SIM comes in handy, right? So back to like the top of the hour, when you were asking like what are the benefits or drawbacks with having an MDR that has coverage versus an MDR that goes deep on a particular tech. Right. An MDR that coverage can lean into, okay, if that custom web app is your crown jewels, let's talk about how we would actually get a signal out of that and then what I would do to investigate, right? Like that's a thing, right? If you're just covering EDR or whatever, going to be a little more challenging. You'll have to instrument the server that it's running on and then hope that that's enough to get there. There's one last thing I would call out, which is this. In the case where you have something that goes bump in the night in the web app, the thing that I've discovered over time is that the harder part is not necessarily the detection, although that can get tricky depending on what you're looking for. But the harder part is the response, because, okay, like how do I investigate this? Like, is that normal? Like, is that supposed to happen? And when you get to the answer of no, who do you call? What does the escalation path look like, and that kind of stuff? And that's where you get into like, hey, has anyone ever run like an incident simulation on this thing? Like one of the things that was kind of interesting, we were working with a customer, this was a number of years ago now, and they had some custom applications, crown jewels, this kind of thing. We ran through sort of like, okay, what would risk look like here? And then we're like, okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that got popped right there, who would we call? And they're like, no, I don't even know. I have no idea. No idea. Like, how would you turn it off? Like, that's a thing that you want to have an answer to, right? And right quick. So that's a thing, because when we deal with folks who are in the cloud, a lot of times the answer is like, okay, well, we're gonna turn off, we're gonna shut down that VPC, or we're gonna turn off that EC2 instance or something like that. And then the question is, okay, like who has the credentials to do that? Like at 2 a.m. right? Like who do we call, right? And that gets to be kind of a tough call. So
that's one we'll want to record, I think, because that's some good advice. I think, what's an incident look, because that's a big area. A lot of people seem to ignore them, and you're right. Who even knows how to get into it? And if you did get into it, what would you look for?
It's 100%. And I mean, like, so one of the things that's funny is, and people forget this, because if you haven't worked the glass, if you haven't done a 2 a.m. shift where you're trying to get a hold of somebody and you realize their phone is not by their bed, it's real ugly, right? So you end up in a situation where you're like, okay, so there's one developer who has the root password for this thing, who can do any of this, and they go on vacation. Okay, well, you have an unacceptable risk situation. I don't care how much we monitor, we're actually not going to be able to respond particularly well, because when we do, Susie is going to be on vacation. That's a problem, right? Yeah.
Right. So. Yeah. Okay.
So Kirk, this kind of leads me into a question. Usually we close out these things by me, asking Matt a question, but I'm going to ask you a question this time. So, now that we've kind of talked through a lot of this, Can you give us a little more details on how SynerComm positions this and how it fits into your overall portfolio?
Yeah, SynerComm basically, I think, does 4 things that we can help with, and keep it real simple. You know, we have a pretty nice full suite of information assurance solutions. So we do the penetration testing, the adversary simulations, the web apps, the compliance things like you mentioned, NIST and all that. So we got information assurance. We have a multi-cloud practice, just so that obviously helps us stay really relevant in the security world also, but helping customers that are trying to put things in the cloud. That's the second thing we do. The other thing that's unique why we work is Matt and company, they don't have any interest in selling tools, and we actually have a pretty healthy VAR practice, which is kind of unique. So we can sell a lot of the tools and help install and configure them. So that's an area that we can complement clients very well. So that's a technology sourcing, but also the staff augmentation and potential help in getting things installed. So that's really the 4 things we do: the information assurance, they talked about the multi-cloud type things where everything is kind of headed. And then the technology sourcing, which actually Expel is an example of one of those types of things. And then the staff augmentation to provide resources to get that done.
Nice. Cool. Well, Matt, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining IT Trendsetters.